Hello everybody. So what I want to talk about today is the power of the mind, and in particular how what we say to ourselves influences our mind and body, how our beliefs impact the mind and how our mindset impacts our beliefs, and also the pictures that we create in our head, so how we use our imagination. So often when I talk to people about how the mind affects the body, people say, yeah, they understand that that's the case, that the mind affects the body. So I want to put a question to you, and I'll give you the chance to reply to this. The question is, what examples do we have that the mind can affect the body? So I'm just going to give you a moment to just note any quick replies. Angie says, can see and hear. Hi Angie, nice to see you there. So what examples do you have, either personally or based on research that you've heard, that the mind can affect the body? So one example is your first driving test. Anyone who's learned to drive can probably remember what their first driving test was like. I know I had to go to the loo before because I was nervous, going to be in charge of a ton of steel. Exams is another example. And what's happening here is that Jack Canfield talks about this equation, E plus R equals O, where E is the event and R is the response. So the event, say for instance you're about to have your first driving test, it's about how you respond to that. Some people might be excited and feeling confident, maybe because they've been driving illegally for a year, like a friend of mine did. Other people like me were probably a bit nervous, thinking, oh my God, this is a bit scary. So let's have a look. Thoughts, if negative, can affect the body when you are stressed. Yeah. Speaking, Hazel says, speaking in public, presentations, etc. I go red. Yeah, that's familiar to many people. A friend of mine yesterday went to something called Toastmasters, where people learn to get more comfortable about speaking in public. And she said it was really fascinating because there were people there who were successful business owners, and yet they still absolutely hated the idea of talking in public. So Katina says, any stored up trauma affects the nervous system, which can then lead on to chronic stress. Yeah. So thanks. So there's just a few examples. What's really interesting to me is, although when I ask people that question, how does the mind affect the body, people can come up with examples and they can understand that there is a relationship. But what is really interesting to me is that when it comes to health and illness, that understanding seems to go out the window, because some people just don't consider the impact of the mind on our health and well-being. Now, I've mentioned before a professor from Stanford University called Robert Sapolsky. He's written a book called Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers. And one of the key things in that book that I found fascinating was when he's talking about the research about why zebras don't get ulcers. And what he's saying is that zebras don't do two things that humans do. The first thing they don't do is they don't ruminate on the past. So they don't say things like, I shouldn't have tried to get friendly with that female zebra when she was chatting to her friends. Oh my God, what an idiot. And they're not thinking about the future and worrying about it. So they're not saying, I really hope the watering hole isn't busy tomorrow because it was bedlam this morning. And what the professor says is that these are two things humans do. So as well as the really big stressors that people experience, all these small stressors, if we keep doing them, cumulatively add up and can cause all sorts of health problems. And what's going on is human beings are doing two things. They're talking to themselves in a certain way, and they're creating pictures in their head. So we know that, as a couple of you have mentioned, is that certain situations can result in us generating stress. And so what's going on here is it's our perception of the situation that is making the difference. I'll talk a bit more about that in a moment. Now, we also know that the mind can shape the brain. And for years, scientists believed that the adult brain was fixed. And it was only in 2000 that someone called Eleanor Maguire from UCL did some really pivotal research into the brains of black cab drivers. She was fascinated to see how learning the knowledge impacted their brain. Black cab drivers have to learn a certain number of streets in London. Any guesses how many streets they have to memorise? It's my alarm going off. Any guesses how many streets black cab drivers have to memorise? A friend of mine is a black cab driver, and I have tested him. And he can actually, if I say, right, let's drive from my house to Wembley Stadium, and I want you to tell me all the side roads if I test you, and he can do it. And he can even tell me the side roads of the side roads. So any guesses? Wow, good guess by Angie, 29,000. That's very close. It's actually 25,000, which is pretty amazing, isn't it? Obviously, that was before we had sat-nav, and I think people are starting to rely on that more and more. But that research showed that the adult brain does change. What we practice, we get good at. So I want to talk about beliefs and the power of beliefs. We know that beliefs are powerful. You've given me some examples already. A very interesting area that illustrates the power of belief is the placebo effect. So, for example, there was a famous study where an eminent surgeon got people who needed an operation on their knee, and he split them into two groups. One group, he performed this surgery on their knee, sewed them up. The other group, he made a little incision, but didn't do anything, and sewed them up again. When they looked at the results a few months later, they found the outcomes were the same. And actually, I think a couple of years later, they actually told the people who they'd not done any surgery on, so they'd done the sham surgery, that, it was a sham. And what was fascinating is that some people said, wow, that means I'm amazing, because at some level I did that in my head. I believed that I'd had surgery and my knee was better. But some people actually, when they realised it was sham surgery, they started to get the knee problems again, which, is pretty interesting. We also know Roger Bannister broke the 4-minute mile, and that's a really interesting example of the power of beliefs, because at one point doctors didn't believe it was possible, and he actually did it by reframing the way he thought about the 4-minute mile. So instead of thinking about 4 minutes, he was thinking, well, actually it's 240 seconds. And currently, if I'm running at 247 seconds, maybe I can just shave some time off that, improve my performance. And by doing that, he got closer and closer until he actually broke the record. And what's interesting is that within a year of him breaking the record, I think 8 people broke the record and broke his record. And the following year, over 50 people did the same thing. There's also some research that was done on a group of cleaners who worked in hotels, and they asked them the question, do you exercise regularly? And 2/3 of them said, no, I don't exercise regularly. 1/3 of them said, actually, I don't do any exercise. Actually, in truth, their job as cleaners burned up a lot of calories and did count as a lot of physical exercise. And so they split them into 2 groups, and they did nothing with one group, and the other group, they actually said to them, look, the exercise you're doing is, or the work you're doing as a cleaner counts as exercise, and it is beneficial, and you should notice the benefits. Oh, thanks, Colleen. Colleen says, this has also happened with cancer drugs. The placebo worked when the patients were told it wasn't a drug they took, the cancer returned. Yeah, that's really fascinating, isn't it? So back to the cleaners. When they followed these people up, I think a couple of weeks later, they found that the cleaners that they'd done this short presentation, I think it was 15 minutes long, they dropped weight, their blood pressure reduced, their body fat reduced, and they actually felt more job satisfaction. So let's talk a little bit about mindset and the power of the mindset. There's some really fascinating research that's been done looking at the difference between people who have a fixed mindset and people who have a growth mindset. And some of the things they've discovered is that if you have a fixed mindset, then if you have a setback, you conclude you're incapable, you lose interest in a challenge or a task, and you have the tendency to withdraw. Whereas if you have a growth mindset, the belief that, you can learn, grow and develop, then actually you see setbacks as just part of the growth experience. People with the fixed mindset, according to research, believe that effort is bad. They feel like they should be able to do something without effort, and it's a sign of low ability. Whereas people with the growth mindset actually see effort as a good thing because it helps us grow and develop. And there was a experiment or a study where people were given, I think children were given a task, and what they noticed is that people who they perceived as having a fixed mindset, their brains were most active when they were given feedback about how they'd done. So their concern was how they were perceived. Whereas the children with the growth mindset, their brain was most active when they were getting feedback about how they could do better and how they can learn, how they can improve their learning. And in another study, children were given a task, and they said to some children, "You did well, you must be smart." Now that's deemed to be fixed mindset feedback. And these people, when they were given a harder task, they actually didn't perform as well. The children who had the growth mindset feedback, so they were told, "You did really well, you must have worked hard," when they were given the harder task, they performed better. And actually, when they gave both sets of children the easier task again, the children who'd been given the fixed mindset feedback did less well, and the children who'd given the growth mindset feedback did better. There's a chap called Josh Waitskin, I think his name is. He's a chess champion, and he went on to learn Tai Chi and became a master at that. And he said, if we win because we are winners, then when we lose, it must make us losers. Okay? So what's interesting is that we can change our mindset. And a researcher called Carol Dweck has done research looking at if you actually start to teach people about how to have a growth mindset mentality, some of those things that I've just been talking about, people start to improve in their performance, how they do at challenges and tasks.